6 months after my father died, the HOA sent me a letter. Unused land, it said. Subject to reclamation. I laughed. Ranch. Then the fines started arriving weekly. At the town meeting, I stayed calm. I just listened. The HOA president smiled the whole time. But her hands were shaking under the table. Because 3 days earlier, my trail camera had caught something she never meant for anyone to see. My name is Rachel Doss, 34, and I run cattle on the same 80 acres my grandfather cleared by hand outside a small Texas town called Millbrook. After my father's funeral, I moved back full-time, alone, with 2 dogs, a rusted truck, and a mortgage I intended to pay off with beef and stubbornness. Millbrook Ridge Estate sat just past our fence line, a gated community built a decade ago on land my father sold off during a lean year. He always said selling that parcel was his one regret. I didn't understand why until Diane Colton became their HOA president. Diane had married into old Millbrook money and out of it just as fast. But she kept the manners of someone who expected to be obeyed. She ran the HOA the way some people run small kingdoms, newsletters full of warnings, fines disguised as community standards, and a board that rubber-stamped whatever she wanted. My father had clashed with her for years over the shared gravel road that ran along our property line, the one his family used before her subdivision existed. Diane insisted it belonged to the HOA now. Dad kept the deed in a fireproof box and never once raised his voice about it. After he passed, Diane sent flowers to the funeral and a letter about boundary compliance 9 days later. I chalked it up to bad timing. I didn't yet understand that with Diane. Nothing was ever bad timing. Everything she did was calculated, including sympathy. The first real friction came over my cattle grazing near the back fence, the one bordering a stretch of dense woods that separated my land from the estate's undeveloped southern lot. Diane claimed the smell affected property values. My cattle had grazed there since before her subdivision had a paved road. I offered to move the herd rotation further from the fence as a courtesy, even though I wasn't obligated to. Diane didn't seem satisfied by the compromise. She seemed almost disappointed that I'd agreed so easily, like she'd wanted a fight instead of a solution. I started noticing cars idling near my gate in the evenings, engines running, headlights off. When I mentioned it to my neighbor Walt, an old rancher 2 properties down, he just shook his head. Diane's been eyeing that back lot of yours for a long while, he said. Longer than you'd think. Walt told me something strange that years ago, before Diane's subdivision was finished, surveyors had marked a chunk of our southern woods as part of the estate's undeveloped green space. My father fought the survey and won, keeping the boundary where it had always been. Diane, seemed, had never accepted that loss. I didn't think much of old history at the time. I had a ranch to run, bills to pay, and grief I hadn't finished sitting with. I told myself the HOA was just a nuisance, a minor headache from people with too much time and too many committee meetings. Then Diane requested a walkthrough of my unused acreage for what she called a routine boundary review. I declined, since my land wasn't part of her HOA. She didn't argue, smiled and said, "We'll find another way to look, then." That sentence stuck with me longer than it should have. It wasn't threatening on its surface, but something in her tone made my stomach turn. I chalked it up to nerves. Grief makes you suspicious of everything, I told myself. I was wrong about how suspicious I needed to be. Around that time, I noticed my southern fence line had been cut and respliced in 2 places, poorly, like someone in a hurry had gone through and covered their tracks. I assumed coyotes or kids. I mended it and moved on, too busy to ask the harder question of who and why. A week later, an anonymous complaint hit the county about neglected livestock on my property. An animal control officer, a young guy named Pete, drove out to check. He found healthy cattle, a full water trough, and clean pens. He apologized for wasting my time and left looking almost embarrassed for coming. I asked Pete who'd filed the complaint. He wasn't allowed to say, but he mentioned it came from someone with a Millbrook Ridge address, and that it was oddly specific about acreage I rarely used. My far southern woods, the same stretch Diane wanted surveyed. That's when the fines truly began. $500 for an unregistered outbuilding, an old hay barn that had stood since 1987. $200 for excessive vegetation, along a fence I didn't even share with the HOA. Every notice arrived on Diane's letterhead, signed with her looping, deliberate signature. I called the county clerk's office to confirm my land wasn't legally part of the HOA jurisdiction. The clerk laughed, almost sympathetically, and said, "Not the first call like this we've gotten about Millbrook Ridge this year." She wouldn't elaborate, but the pattern in her voice was clear enough. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting as a guest, mostly to understand what I was dealing with. Diane ran it like a courtroom where she was also the judge. Homeowners nodded along nervously. One woman, Carla, caught my eye and gave the smallest, most careful shake of her head. After the meeting, Carla found me in the parking lot. She'd lived in the estate 3 years and said Diane had a pattern: target a neighbor, escalate fines, then offer a generous buyout once people got desperate enough to want out. "She's done it twice before," Carla whispered.
Both times.
I asked why nobody stopped her. Carla just laughed, bitter and quiet. Half the board owes her favors. The other half is scared of her. And the ones who complain get audited for violations within a month. She looked over her shoulder before saying it, like Diane's ears stretched past the parking lot. That night I pulled every document my father had kept: deeds, survey maps, old correspondence with the county, and spread them across the kitchen table. Somewhere in that paperwork, I told myself, there had to be proof strong enough to make Diane back off for good. I just hadn't found it yet. I also noticed something odd in my father's old files. A rejected easement request from years back, submitted by Diane's late husband before the subdivision was even finished, asking to use our southern woods as temporary storage for construction equipment. My father had denied it in writing, calling it inappropriate and undisclosed use. I didn't understand what undisclosed use meant back then. I filed it away as ancient history, another example of Diane's family wanting something that was never theirs. I had no idea that phrase would matter more than almost anything else in that folder. Once I finally understood what she was hiding, the real conflict erupted on a Tuesday morning when I found a certified letter taped to my gate. Diane was formally requesting the county condemn my southern 8 acres as abandoned agricultural land, citing lack of use, structural decay, and this part made my blood run cold, documented animal welfare concerns. I called the county planning office immediately. The woman on the phone confirmed a hearing had already been scheduled in 6 weeks. Diane hadn't just complained. She'd built an entire file against me, complete with photographs I'd never consented to and reports from inspections I was never notified about. I requested copies of everything under public records law. What arrived stunned me: photos of overgrown brush, a collapsed section of old fence, and blurry images of animals I didn't recognize. Not my cattle. Crowded together, photographed from a strange angle deep inside the tree line. I stared at those photos for a long time. I didn't own goats. Animals, period. And definitely nothing that looked crammed into makeshift pens like that. Someone had photographed something real back there, just not anything that belonged to me. I drove out to the southern woods that same afternoon, further than I'd walked in months, past where my cattle usually grazed. The brush was thick, but I noticed something odd: a faint, worn path through the trees, packed dirt, like it had been walked regularly by more than deer. I followed it about 200 yards before hitting a section of my own fence that had clearly been altered. A hidden gate, camouflaged with branches, opening not outward toward the road, but inward, toward Millbrook Ridge Estate's undeveloped lot. My stomach turned cold in the summer heat. I didn't go further that day. Something told me to be careful, to think before I confronted anyone. I photographed the hidden gate myself, marked its GPS coordinates, and drove home with my hands tight on the wheel, replaying Diane's words from weeks earlier. "We'll find another way to look." Then, that night, I called my cousin Marcus, a contractor who did surveillance installs for ranchers dealing with cattle theft. I asked him to set up trail cameras along my southern fence, discreetly pointed at that hidden gate. He agreed, no questions asked, and drove out before sunrise the next morning. For 2 weeks, nothing unusual showed up. Deer, raccoons, one curious fox. I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, if grief and stress were making me paranoid. Then, on a rainy Thursday night, the camera caught headlights, human figures, and the unmistakable sound of animals crying out. The footage was dark and grainy, but I could make out at least 2 people moving crates through the hidden gate, onto my property, deeper into the woods. One of them moved with a familiar, upright posture, shoulders back, chin high, exactly like Diane at every meeting I'd sat through. I didn't sleep that night, trying to convince myself I was wrong, that it was just contractors or utility workers. But contractors don't move crates through a hidden gate at 11 at night in the rain, using someone else's fence line without permission. The next morning, Animal Control got another anonymous complaint about my property, this time claiming I'd been hoarding livestock in unsafe conditions. Pete, the same young officer from before, looked genuinely uncomfortable delivering the news. "I have to inspect," he said. "But something about this doesn't sit right with me either." I walked Pete straight to the hidden gate before he could even ask where to start. His face changed the moment he saw the worn path and the camouflaged fence altered from the wrong side. "This isn't your gate," he said slowly. "Someone built this to look like it belongs to your property." We didn't go further that day, either. Pete said crossing into undeveloped HOA land without a warrant or clear jurisdiction could compromise any future investigation. But he took photos, logged coordinates, and told me quietly, "Keep your cameras running. Don't confront anyone yet. Let this build itself." I asked him why he seemed to already suspect something. He hesitated, then admitted Animal Control had received similar hoarding complaints tied to Millbrook Ridge addresses over the past 2 years. Always vague, always anonymous, always timed right before a property dispute with the HOA came to a head. That night, Diane called me directly for the first time. Her voice was syrup-sweet, offering to make this whole unpleasant business disappear if I'd simply sign over the southern 8 acres at what she called a fair market rate, well below anything close to fair. I told her I needed time to think. She didn't like that answer. For just a second. You don't want a public hearing about animal welfare violations, Rachel. Trust me. Everyone involved. Then the syrup came back, like a mask sliding back into place, and she said good night. I hung up shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden, sharp certainty that Diane wasn't bluffing about the hearing. She was bluffing about who the violations actually belonged to. Somewhere back in those woods, something was happening that had nothing to do with my cattle and everything to do with her. I called Marcus again and asked him to add 2 more cameras, further into the tree line, angled toward whatever lay beyond the hidden gate. He warned me this was starting to sound like more than a fence dispute. I told him I was starting to think he was right. Carla texted me 2 days later. An unfamiliar number. Just one line. Don't sign anything. Meet me at the diner off Route 9. Alone. I sat with that message for a long time before deciding grief had already cost me enough caution. I drove out to meet her the next morning. Carla arrived nervous, glancing at the door every few minutes. She told me she'd once seen Diane's adult son, Bryce, driving a livestock trailer into the estate's undeveloped lot late at night, over a year ago. I never said anything, Carla admitted. I didn't want to be her next target. Bryce Colton, I learned, had been quietly running a breeding operation for years, exotic rabbits, then dogs, then, according to rumors Carla had heard secondhand, something involving roosters that made her lower her voice even in an empty diner. He'd been cited twice by the county and evaded both times. Both citations, turned out, had been filed against an address that didn't exist. A paperwork trick Bryce apparently learned from watching his mother manipulate HOA records for years. Carla said Diane had bailed him out financially more than once. Always quietly, always through the HOA's discretionary maintenance fund. I asked Carla directly if she thought Diane knew about whatever was happening in those woods. Carla's laugh had no humor in it at all. Rachel, that woman doesn't sneeze in that neighborhood without knowing about it first. If something's back there, she put it there or she's protecting it. I left the diner with more questions than answers. But one thing had crystallized. This was never really about my unused acreage. It was about a family that needed somewhere hidden to keep something illegal, and a piece of quiet, wooded land no one would think to search until now. The following week, the fines against me tripled. A letter arrived threatening a lien on my property if I didn't pay within 30 days. Stacking penalty on penalty for violations I'd never been formally notified of in time to contest. Diane was accelerating, and I understood exactly why. She needed the condemnation hearing to happen before anyone looked too closely at that backlot. If the county reclaimed my land as abandoned, her family's hidden operation would suddenly sit on HOA-controlled property, safely out of my hands and conveniently out of anyone's curious eye line, including mine. I hired an attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Anand who specialized in property disputes involving overreaching HOAs. She read through the fine notices and let out a low whistle. Half of these citations don't cite an actual bylaw, she said. This isn't enforcement. This is intimidation dressed up as paperwork. Priya filed a formal request demanding Diane produce the original bylaw provisions justifying each fine, plus the source of every animal welfare complaint filed against me. HOA regulations required disclosure within 15 business days. Diane had never expected anyone to actually ask, let alone have a lawyer force the question. The 15 days passed. Late. Incomplete. Citing bylaws that Priya quickly proved had been quietly amended just 8 months earlier. Amendments passed at a meeting with suspiciously low attendance. Conveniently timed right around when my father passed away and I inherited the ranch. Priya suspected the amendments had been drafted specifically to target undeveloped, agriculturally zoned properties bordering the estate, meaning me, and possibly others before me. This isn't the first time she's used the bylaws like a weapon, Priya said.
I wanna know who else.
We found 2 former residents through county property transfer records, families who'd sold land bordering Millbrook Ridge to the HOA itself at below market prices within the last 5 years, both after facing eerily similar waves of sudden fines and anonymous complaints. Both sales closed within months of the complaints starting. One of the sellers, a retired schoolteacher named Ellen, agreed to talk to Priya over the phone. She described the exact same pattern, a hidden path through her woods she'd never authorized, complaints about smells and neglect, and a phone call from Diane offering to make the unpleasantness disappear. Ellen had sold rather than fight, exhausted and alone after her husband's death. Not so different from where I stood now. She'd never gone back to check what was on that land after the sale. I just wanted it over, she told Priya. I didn't have the strength you seem to have. Hearing Ellen's story lit something in me that grief alone hadn't managed to. This wasn't just about my father's ranch anymore. It was about a pattern of vulnerable people, the recently widowed, the newly grieving, being systematically pressured off land that apparently served a very specific, very hidden purpose. I asked Priya if we could get access to Ellen's old parcel, now technically part of the HOA's undeveloped holdings. Priya said without probable cause or a warrant. We couldn't set foot there, but nothing stopped us from documenting activity visible from public roads or from my own adjoining property. Marcus repositioned one camera toward the tree line separating my land from Ellen's former parcel. Within 4 days, it caught the same pattern, headlights after dark, crates being moved, and again, that same upright, familiar posture supervising from a comfortable distance while others did the physical work. I brought the footage to Pete at Animal Control, off the record, since it technically sat outside official jurisdiction for now. He watched it twice, jaw tight. That's not livestock management, he said quietly. That's someone running an unlicensed operation and using empty land as cover. I need to escalate this internally. Pete warned me that escalating too fast, without solid documentation, could tip Diane off and give her time to relocate everything before any real investigation began. We need more, he said. Numbers, conditions, proof of scale. Otherwise she'll claim it's nothing, clean it up overnight, and we lose our only window. Marcus suggested a drone, something we could fly at a safe legal altitude over the tree line without technically trespassing, to get a visual count of whatever was hidden back there. I hesitated. It felt like crossing further into something dangerous, but Ellen's story kept echoing in my head. We flew the drone at dawn, when animal activity tends to be highest and human activity lowest. What the camera captured stopped my breath entirely. Rows of makeshift enclosures stretching further than I'd imagined. Dozens upon dozens of animals, far more than any hobby operation could ever explain away. Marcus counted at least 60 animals visible in that single pass. And the enclosures clearly extended beyond the drone's frame, deeper into the woods where the canopy blocked our view entirely. "This isn't 60, he said grimly. "This is 60 we can see. There's more back there." I sat in stunned silence in my truck, watching that footage loop, thinking about every fine, every anonymous complaint, every meeting where Diane smiled while accusing me of neglect. All of it had been misdirection, a smokescreen designed to keep anyone from looking too closely at her own family's backyard. Priya advised extreme caution moving forward. Illegally obtained evidence, even from a drone, could complicate any future case if we weren't careful about how it was gathered and used. "Document everything through proper channels now," she said. "Let Pete build the official case. We support it. We don't lead it." I agreed, reluctantly, even though every instinct told me to march straight to the county with what I'd seen. Patience had never been my strongest trait, but grief and anger together had taught me one thing my father always said: the loudest reaction rarely wins against someone who plans quietly. That week, the HOA sent notice that the condemnation hearing had been moved up 2 full weeks, citing urgent community health concerns. Diane was accelerating faster than we could build our case. Priya requested an emergency continuance, citing the still unresolved public records dispute over the fine bylaws. The county granted a short delay. Diane showed up unannounced at my ranch that evening, alone, no board members trailing behind her for once. She stood at my gate, arms crossed, and said flatly, "You're making a mistake fighting this, Rachel. Your father knew when to let something go." I'd hoped his daughter learned the same lesson. I asked her directly what exactly was on the land she wanted so badly. Her expression flickered, just for a second. Something under the polish cracked, before she recovered and said, "Overgrown brush and a liability. Nothing more." I told her I'd let the county decide that for themselves. She left without another word, but I noticed her glance linger toward the southern tree line before she got back in her car. That same worn, guilty look Carla had described from the diner. Whatever was back there mattered enough to Diane that she'd driven out personally to try one last time. Marcus flagged unusual activity from the cameras that same night. Multiple vehicles, later than usual, moving with visible urgency. "They're panicking," he texted me. "Looks like they're trying to move something before your hearing gets rescheduled." I called Pete immediately, and for the first time, he agreed we couldn't wait any longer. Pete said he could request an emergency welfare check based on the volume and urgency of activity documented. But he needed something concrete, a credible tip he could officially log, separate from our private surveillance, to justify moving fast enough to catch whatever they were trying to relocate before it vanished entirely. That's when Carla called again, her voice trembling but resolved. "I'll go on record," she said. "I saw Bryce loading crates into a trailer an hour ago. I have the license plate." For the first time in weeks, I felt something like hope. For a few days after Carla's call, everything went strangely quiet. Pete logged her tip officially, and the emergency welfare check request moved into county processing. No new fines arrived. No anonymous complaints. Diane didn't call or show up at my gate. It felt less like peace than the eye of a storm. Priya warned me not to mistake silence for surrender. "People like Diane don't stop," she said. They regroup. I tried to focus on the ranch itself for those few days. Mending fence, checking on the herd, letting my body remember what ordinary work felt like after weeks of tension. I found myself standing at the southern fence line more than usual, staring toward the tree line where I now knew something terrible was hidden, unable to unknow it. My father used to say a ranch teaches you patience because animals don't care about your urgency. I was failing to learn that lesson. Marcus's cameras stayed quiet too. No vehicles, no crates, nothing but wind and wildlife. Either they moved everything already, he warned, or they're waiting to see what you do next. Pete confirmed the welfare check request was still pending county approval, stuck behind paperwork that felt agonizingly slow given the stakes. I used the lull to gather every piece of documentation Priya requested. Photos, timestamps, Ellen's statement, Carla's tip, the drone footage stored securely off any device connected to my home network, just in case. Priya insisted on redundancy. If something disappears, she said, we need 3 more copies somewhere safe. One evening, Pete called with unexpected news. Animal Control had cross-referenced complaint records statewide and found a pattern of unlicensed breeding and hoarding operations tied to a name registered under a shell business, Ridge Legacy Holdings, LLC. The registered agent's address matched Diane's own home in Millbrook Ridge Estates. Priya dug into the LLC's filings and found something even more damning. Bryce Colton was listed as a managing member, alongside a second name neither of us recognized at first. Harold Voss, a man later confirmed as Diane's brother, living 2 counties over, apparently running distribution for whatever was bred back there. The pieces started forming a picture uglier than I'd imagined. This wasn't a careless hobby spiraling out of control. It was an organized, multi-person operation, using my land and Ellen's former land as cover, hidden behind an HOA president's reputation and a community too intimidated to ask questions out loud. I asked Pete what kind of operation typically involved this scale of secrecy. Shell companies, and multiple relatives spread across counties. He hesitated before answering carefully. Could be breeding for illegal sale. Could be something worse involving fighting rings. We won't know the full scope until we're actually inside those enclosures. That phrase, fighting rings, sat heavy in my chest for days. I thought of every smell complaint, every anonymous report, every excuse Diane had used to try pushing me off my own family's land, and realized how badly she needed nobody to ever look closely enough to ask what those animals actually were. Priya scheduled a meeting with the county district attorney's office, presenting everything we'd gathered as a coordinated pattern rather than isolated complaints. The DA's office, to our relief, took it seriously immediately, especially once Ellen's statement about her own forced sale entered the conversation alongside the shell company paperwork. The DA's investigator, the calm, methodical woman named Renata, told us the county needed just one more piece, direct, current evidence of animals in distress or illegal conditions, gathered through a proper warrant, to justify a full raid rather than a routine, easily anticipated inspection Diane could stage manage in advance. Give us 48 hours, Renata said, and we'll have a warrant ready to execute the moment your cameras show renewed activity. The quiet, I realized, hadn't been the end of anything. It had been the last calm breath before everything I'd uncovered finally came crashing down around Diane Colton all at once. The 48 hours stretched into 4 agonizing days before Marcus's cameras caught movement again. A livestock trailer backing toward the hidden gate at 2 in the morning. Headlights cut, 3 figures working fast in near total darkness. I called Renata immediately, hands shaking as I read her the timestamp aloud. Renata said the warrant wasn't ready yet. Still waiting on a judge's signature scheduled for later that morning. Don't approach, she warned firmly. Don't confront anyone. If they finish moving everything before we execute, we lose our best chance at catching this in progress. I spent that night wide awake, watching live camera feeds from my kitchen table, my 2 dogs pressed against my legs as if they sensed my fear. Around 4 a.m., the trailer left, but the enclosures remained visible in the footage. Still crowded, still moving with restless animal sounds I could hear. By sunrise, Renata called with the signed warrant in hand. County Animal Control, sheriff's deputies, and a state agricultural inspector would execute a joint raid that afternoon, entering through the legal boundary of Ellen's former parcel, now technically HOA property. Avoiding any question about jurisdiction over my own land, I wasn't allowed to accompany the raid team, which frustrated me more than I expected after everything I'd uncovered. Priya reminded me gently that my job now was staying visible, staying calm, and letting the system built on the evidence I'd gathered do exactly what it was designed to do. Word moves fast in a small town, though, and by early afternoon, half of Millbrook seemed to know something big was happening at the estate. Carla texted updates from her porch, watching sheriff vehicles roll past her window toward the undeveloped lot where the hidden operation had sat for years unnoticed. Diane, according to Carla, came storming out of her house the moment the vehicles turned toward the tree line, demanding to know what was happening on HOA property without her authorization. A deputy calmly informed her they had a warrant and asked her, not gently, to step back from the perimeter. What the raid team found inside those woods exceeded even what our drone footage had suggested. Renata called Priya 2 hours in, her voice unusually tight even for someone as composed as she'd always seemed. 200 animals, she said. Dogs, roosters, rabbits. Conditions are, Rachel, it's really bad. 200 animals, even as I heard it spoken aloud. 200 living creatures crammed into hidden enclosures behind camouflaged fencing, discovered only because a grieving woman refused to sign away her father's land without asking one uncomfortable question first. Deputies found Bryce Colton on site, attempting to load a final trailer of roosters when the raid began. Gear in the truck bed later identified by investigators as consistent with organized animal fighting operations. Not the breeding hobby Diane had always implied whenever anyone dared ask what her son actually did. Harold Voss, Diane's brother, was located an hour later at a rented storage unit 2 counties over, where investigators found records, financial ledgers, and evidence of an active distribution network stretching well beyond Millbrook. Proof this had never been small, contained, or nearly as controlled as Diane liked to pretend. Diane herself was detained for questioning at the scene, though not yet arrested, insisting loudly that she'd known nothing about what her son and brother were doing on unused HOA land. Deputies, however, had already recovered the LLC paperwork listing her as the registered agent, her signature on multiple filings. Renata told Priya later that Diane's claim of ignorance collapsed almost immediately once investigators found handwritten ledgers documenting HOA discretionary funds quietly funneled toward
the operation over 3 years, funds meant for community landscaping and maintenance, redirected instead into feed, enclosures, and what looked like veterinary supplies bought in bulk.
sat in my kitchen that evening, watching local news footage of animal rescue trucks lined up along the road bordering my own southern fence. Volunteers carrying crate after crate of frightened, malnourished animals toward temporary shelter. My father's disputed easement request, denied years earlier, suddenly made painful, obvious sense. Diane's late husband had tried to secure that land for temporary storage before the subdivision even finished. My father had refused, calling it inappropriate and undisclosed use, without ever knowing exactly what he'd prevented. Diane had spent years trying to finish what her husband started, using fear instead of paperwork. The county press released the next morning confirmed what Renata had told us privately. 206 animals recovered, most in poor condition, several requiring immediate veterinary intervention, evidence consistent with both illegal breeding operations and, in a smaller subset of roosters, organized animal fighting activity under active investigation. Bryce was charged that same week with multiple felony counts related to animal cruelty and illegal fighting operations. Harold faced charges tied to distribution and interstate trafficking of illegally bred animals, a scope far larger than Millbrook's quiet streets could have ever suggested to anyone driving past that gated entrance. Diane, despite her insistence of ignorance, was charged separately with financial fraud related to the misuse of HOA funds, plus obstruction after investigators found deleted emails referencing the operation, recovered anyway through a subpoenaed backup server the HOA's own IT contractor had set up years earlier without her knowledge. That detail almost made me laugh out loud when Priya told me. The very bureaucratic thoroughness Diane had weaponized against ordinary homeowners for years had quietly preserved the exact evidence needed to convict her. Every overreaching policy, every mandatory system, existed because Diane herself had insisted on total documentation. News of the raid spread through Millbrook within days, and the HOA board, most of whom had quietly enabled Diane's reign out of fear, scrambled to distance themselves publicly. An emergency meeting was called, this time without Diane presiding, attended by more residents than I'd ever seen at one gathering. Carla stood up during that meeting and told her story publicly for the first time. The fear, the years of silence. The moment she finally decided speaking up mattered more than her own comfort. Several other residents came forward afterward, describing their own quiet intimidation at Diane's hands over the years. Ellen drove 3 hours from her new home to attend, standing quietly at the back of the room until someone recognized her and asked her to speak. She described selling her land under pressure, never knowing what she'd truly been forced away from, until Priya's investigation finally connected the pieces years later. The board voted unanimously to remove Diane from her position immediately, pending the outcome of her criminal case, and to formally rescind the bylaw amendments Priya had proven were quietly passed without proper notice. My fines, all of them, were voided the same evening, along with the condemnation hearing itself. I didn't attend that meeting myself, watching instead from Carla's phone over a video call, sitting on my own porch with my dogs beside me and the southern woods finally quiet in the distance. The hidden gate now marked with police tape instead of camouflage branches meant to hide something monstrous. Priya later told me the county planned restitution proceedings against Diane, Bryce, and Harold jointly, aimed at covering veterinary costs, shelter expenses, and damages tied to Ellen's forced sale years earlier, though restitution, everyone agreed, could never fully repay what Ellen and the animals themselves had already endured. The animal rescue organization coordinating recovery efforts asked if I'd be willing to let volunteers use part of my land temporarily for triage, since it sat closest to the site and already had usable fencing. I agreed without hesitation, watching my own southern pasture fill with tents and veterinarians within a day, working alongside those volunteers over the following week. I saw firsthand what 200 animals in distress actually looked like up close. Matted fur, untreated wounds, animals flinching at sudden movement after years of neglect disguised as a quiet hobby behind a respectable gated community's manicured entrance sign. One rescue volunteer, a soft-spoken woman named Dana, told me most of the roosters showed clear signs consistent with organized fighting, scarring patterns investigators would later use as key evidence in Bryce's case. "People don't imagine this happening somewhere like this," she said quietly.
That's exactly why.
I thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. That respectability itself had been Diane's best disguise. Nobody suspected the HOA president, the woman obsessed with lawn heights and mailbox colors, because cruelty on that scale didn't fit the image she'd spent years carefully constructing for herself and her family. The county held Diane's first court appearance 3 weeks later. I attended, sitting beside Priya and Ellen in the gallery, watching a woman who'd once threatened to make my life ugly stand quietly in a plain blazer while a judge read charges that would define the rest of her life. Diane didn't look at me once during that hearing, her eyes fixed somewhere on the wood grain of the defense table, though I noticed her hands trembling the same way they had at that town meeting months earlier, when my trail camera had already caught what she never meant anyone to see. Bryce's case moved faster. Given the physical evidence recovered on site, the fighting gear, the injured roosters, testimony from rescue veterinarians. He accepted a plea deal that included significant prison time, a lifetime ban on animal ownership, and mandatory restitution payments toward the rescue organization's ongoing veterinary costs. Harold's case grew more complicated as investigators traced his distribution network across state lines, eventually connecting him to similar operations in 2 neighboring counties, expanding what began as a single hidden lot behind my ranch into a much larger criminal investigation involving federal agricultural trafficking statutes. Diane's trial, delayed by her attorney's repeated motions, finally began 4 months after the raid. Priya attended portions as a courtesy, keeping me updated, describing a woman who'd shifted from icy composure to visible desperation as prosecutors laid out 3 years of financial records tracing HOA funds into her family's operation. The most damning testimony came from the HOA's own former treasurer, a soft-spoken man named Gerald who'd quietly resigned 2 years earlier rather than keep signing off on discretionary spending he didn't understand. He testified that Diane had personally instructed him never to itemize certain expenses in board meeting minutes. Gerald admitted he'd stayed silent out of fear for years, watching Diane's pattern of targeting anyone who questioned her too closely, until Carla's public testimony at that emergency meeting finally gave him the courage to come forward himself. "I should have said something sooner," he told the court quietly. I testified on the trial's 3rd day, describing the fines, the anonymous complaints, the hidden gate, and the moment Diane stood at my own front gate telling me my father knew when to let something go. Recounting it aloud in a courtroom felt different than living through it alone at the time. Diane's attorney tried to paint me as an overzealous property owner acting on paranoia, suggesting the drone footage and cameras amounted to harassment of an innocent neighbor. Priya, watching from the gallery, later told me the argument fell apart the moment prosecutors played footage matching Diane's own posture at the hidden gate. That footage, grainy, rain-soaked, but unmistakable once enhanced by forensic analysts, showed Diane herself directing Bryce and Harold on a night we'd captured months earlier, supervising the movement of crates through the hidden gate with the same upright, commanding posture she'd used at every HOA meeting I'd ever attended. Watching that clip play in the courtroom, I finally understood the full weight of what "we'll find another way to look" had actually meant that night on the phone. She hadn't been threatening a hearing. She'd been warning me, in her own twisted way, to stop looking before I found exactly this. The jury deliberated for less than a full day. Diane was convicted on all major counts: financial fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy related to the illegal operation run from land she'd spent years trying to legally seize from vulnerable, grieving neighbors like Ellen and, almost, like me. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. The judge cited the calculated, years-long pattern of exploiting the HOA's authority and targeting recently widowed or bereaved homeowners as an aggravating factor, sentencing Diane to significant prison time alongside Bryce and Harold, plus a permanent ban from any future community leadership position. Ellen attended sentencing too, and afterward, outside the courthouse steps, she hugged me longer than I expected, whispering, "You did what I couldn't." I told her she'd done plenty just by finally speaking up when it mattered most. Plenty that helped the jury understand this wasn't an isolated incident at all. The Millbrook Ridge Estates HOA dissolved its old board entirely in the aftermath, holding elections that brought Carla in as the new interim president, alongside Gerald returning to oversee transparent financial reporting for the first time in years. Their first official act was voiding every disputed fine issued during Diane's tenure. My southern 8 acres, once threatened with condemnation, were formally cleared of any HOA claim, the county officially recognizing the original boundary my father had fought to protect decades earlier. The hidden gate was removed entirely, the camouflaged fence replaced with a simple, honest line marking where my land truly began. I used part of the restitution funds, once finally processed months later, to build a proper animal shelter annex on my property, partnering with the same rescue organization that had triaged the recovered animals there during those first chaotic days. Felt right, turning that scarred ground into something healing instead. Dana, the rescue volunteer, ended up staying in Millbrook permanently, taking a position managing the new shelter annex full-time. We became close over those months, bonded by everything we'd witnessed together, and she often reminded me that the 200 animals rescued that day had names now, not just numbers in a file. A year after the raid, I stood at that same southern fence line, watching a rooster named Biscuit, one of the few fighting roosters healthy enough to be rehabilitated rather than only sheltered, peck contentedly around a real pasture. Sunlight instead of camouflage netting overhead for the first time in his life. Carla and I became close friends through everything, meeting for coffee most weeks, laughing sometimes at how absurd it all sounded out loud. An HOA president running an illegal animal operation behind manicured hedges and mailbox regulations, hiding 200 living creatures behind the same fences meant to keep neighbors compliant. Walt, the old rancher who'd first warned me about Diane's history with that land, stopped by one afternoon just to see the new shelter annex, nodding approvingly at the sturdy fencing and clean pens. "Your father would have liked seeing this," he said simply. And that meant more to me than almost anything else said that year. I kept my father's old rejected easement letter framed in the ranch office now, a reminder that his quiet refusal decades earlier, dismissed at the time as stubbornness, over undisclosed land use, had ultimately been the first small barrier standing between Diane's family and finishing what they'd started long before I was born. Priya and I still talk occasionally, mostly about how close the whole case came to unraveling before it truly began. How easily I could have signed Diane's buyout offer out of exhaustion and grief, the way Ellen once had, never knowing what horror had been hidden just beyond that quiet tree line. The county cited our case afterward while drafting new oversight rules for HOA boards statewide, requiring transparent public logging of complaints and fines, specifically referencing the pattern Priya had uncovered involving vulnerable, recently bereaved homeowners targeted through vague, unevidenced violations dressed up as routine community enforcement. Sometimes I think about the woman who once stood at my gate telling me my father knew when to let something go, and I think about how wrong she truly was, not about my father, but about me. Grief hadn't made me weaker or easier to push around. It had made me impossible to move. On quiet evenings now, I walk the southern fence line without dread, past the shelter annex where Biscuit still struts around like he owns the place, past the spot where a hidden gate once stood, replaced now with an open one, unlocked, because there's nothing left back there worth hiding anymore. My father used to say a ranch remembers everything that happens on it, good and bad, long after the people involved have moved on. I believe him now more than ever, standing on land that once hid 200 suffering animals, now home to healed ones, thriving under an open Texas sky. Diane Colton is serving her sentence in a state facility 200 miles from Millbrook, the same distance, ironically, some of Harold's distribution network once stretched. Bryce writes occasionally from prison, according to Gerald, insisting even now that it wasn't as bad as they made it sound. Nobody in town believes him. Harold's case, expanded across 3 counties, resulted in federal charges layered atop his state sentence, ensuring he wouldn't see release for many years, if ever fully accounted for the scale of trafficking investigators eventually traced back through his rented storage units and shell company paperwork. The Millbrook Ridge Estates community, under Carla's leadership, held its first genuinely open town hall meeting 6 months after the raid, inviting residents from outside the gates too, myself included, to discuss rebuilding trust between the subdivision and the ranching families who'd bordered it uneasily for years under Diane's reign. I stood up during that meeting, not to accuse anyone, but to thank the residents who'd quietly helped along the way, Carla's courage, Gerald's testimony, even Pete's careful patience navigating jurisdiction until the evidence was strong enough to act on. Real change, I realized, rarely comes from one person alone. Ellen sent me a letter a few months later, mentioning she'd finally found peace with selling her old land, now that she understood the truth behind why Diane had pressured her so relentlessly all those years ago. She included a photograph of herself smiling in her new garden, sunlight on her face. I keep that photograph pinned in my kitchen now, beside my father's old rejected easement letter. A small reminder that grief and fear can be weaponized by people like Diane, but they can also, eventually, be transformed into something sturdier than either, the kind of quiet resolve that outlasts intimidation entirely. The shelter annex now houses a rotating population of rescued animals from across 3 counties, funded partly by ongoing restitution payments and partly by community donations that grew steadily once Millbrook understood what had actually happened behind those gates for years without their knowledge or consent. Dana and I expanded the annex last spring, adding proper veterinary facilities after securing a small grant, something that felt impossible to imagine standing. at that same fence line 18 months earlier, staring at grainy trail camera footage of headlights and crates moving through a hidden gate in the pouring rain. Marcus still checks in on the cameras occasionally, mostly out of habit now rather than necessity, joking that he half expects to catch nothing more dramatic than deer and the occasional curious fox again. The way it used to be before headlights and crates and a familiar upright posture changed everything. Pete got a promotion within the county animal control department after the case closed, largely credited with recognizing the pattern early and building the careful, patient documentation that eventually justified the warrant. He still stops by occasionally to check on Biscuit, calling him the toughest rooster in Texas with a grin. I think about Carla's whispered warning at that first HOA meeting more than almost anything else from that year, the smallest, most careful shake of her head, a stranger risking Diane's attention just to warn me. Courage, I learned, often starts small and quiet before it grows loud enough to matter. The county's new HOA transparency laws, passed partly in response to our case, now require any fine or violation notice to cite a specific, verifiable bylaw provision, along with the source of any complaint, protecting future homeowners from the exact tactics Diane had used against Ellen, and nearly used successfully against me. Gerald, once too afraid to question Diane's spending, now serves as the HOA's permanent treasurer under Carla's leadership, publishing detailed quarterly financial reports to every resident, a level of transparency that would have been unthinkable during Diane's years running the board like a private kingdom nobody dared to question aloud. My cattle still graze along the southern fence line, closer to it now than I ever allowed during those tense, uncertain months, a quiet symbol that the land my father protected decades earlier finally belongs entirely, undisputedly, to the family who's worked it honestly for 3 generations without interruption. Sometimes visitors touring the shelter annex ask how all of this started, expecting some dramatic confrontation or lucky break. I usually tell them the truth. It started with a certified letter calling my father's land unused, and a refusal, born mostly out of grief and stubbornness, to simply sign it away quietly. Looking back now, I recognize every twist for what it was. Diane's calculated fines, the staged complaints meant to frame me, the hidden history behind my father's old, rejected easement letter, Carla's quiet courage, and finally, the very bureaucratic thoroughness Diane insisted on that ultimately preserved the evidence to convict her. I never expected, standing at my father's graveside 18 months earlier, that grief would eventually lead me toward uncovering 200 suffering animals, exposing a family's hidden cruelty, and helping rewrite the rules protecting future homeowners from exactly the kind of quiet, calculated intimidation Diane had built her entire reputation on. The ranch feels different now, not because anything structural changed, but because the fear that once lived along that southern fence line is simply gone, replaced by the ordinary sounds of cattle, rescued roosters, and volunteers laughing while cleaning pens under an open Texas sky my father would have recognized instantly. Biscuit still struts every morning like he's inspecting the property himself, and Dana jokes he's taken over Diane's old role as self-appointed president, minus the fines and the fear. I laugh every time she says it, because somehow, a rescued rooster ended up with more dignity than the woman who once tried to steal my land. I drove past Millbrook Ridge Estates last week, past the gate where Diane once stood accusing me of neglect, and noticed Carla's new welcome sign near the entrance. Simple and honest, listing community resources instead of warnings about violations. It felt like watching a place slowly remember how to be a neighborhood again. My father's old fireproof box, the one holding the deed he protected so carefully for decades, still sits in my ranch office, though it holds new documents now too: the restitution paperwork, the county's transparency reforms, and Ellen's photograph, proof that quiet refusals can eventually outlast even the most determined intimidation. Some nights, I still walk out to the southern fence line just to sit for a while, listening to the shelter annex settle into quiet. Animals finally safe after years, hidden behind camouflaged branches and manufactured lies. It's the same land Diane once called worthless, now proven to be worth protecting all along. I think about what would have happened if I'd simply signed her buyout offer that first week. Exhausted and grieving, the way Ellen once had. 200 animals might still be hidden back there today, suffering quietly behind a respectable gate, protected by nothing more than everyone's fear of asking one question. That thought stays with me more than almost anything else from that year. How close cruelty came to succeeding simply because it wore the right clothes,
ran the right meetings, and smiled the right smile at exactly the right moments, until one grieving rancher refused to look away from a hidden gate.
Diane's parole hearing is still years away, and I plan to attend when it comes, not out of vengeance, but to make sure the record stays clear about what actually happened on that quiet stretch of land behind Millbrook Ridge Estates, the truth she spent years trying so carefully to bury. For now, though, I focus on what's grown from all of it instead: a working ranch, a thriving shelter annex, a rebuilt community learning honesty under Carla's leadership, and 200 animals, scattered now into loving homes across 3 counties, finally living lives nobody ever meant for them to have. My father always said the land remembers everything, and I believe that more firmly now than the day I first heard those words. It remembered the hidden gate, the crates, the crying animals in the dark. And eventually, it remembered how to heal, the same way I did, one quiet season at a time, standing at the fence line this morning, coffee in hand. I watched Biscuit chase a butterfly across pasture that once held nothing but fear and secrets. My phone buzzed, a message from Priya, a simple update that Diane's appeal had officially failed, the conviction standing exactly as the jury first delivered it. I read the message twice, then set the phone down and just breathed for a moment, feeling something settle in my chest that had been unsteady since the day that first certified letter appeared taped to my gate. It wasn't triumph exactly. Felt more like finally, fully, exhaling after holding my breath for years. I called Carla to share the news, and she laughed with real relief, telling me the new board had just approved funding for a permanent community garden on the old undeveloped lot, the same ground that once hid 200 animals, now destined to grow vegetables residents would share with each other openly. Gerald mentioned during our last call that Millbrook Ridge Estates had officially adopted a new motto for their revised community charter, something Carla had suggested during a late-night planning session. Transparency first, neighbors always. A small phrase, but one that would have been unthinkable under Diane's old, fear-driven leadership. Dana and I finished expanding the shelter annex last month, adding a small visitor area where local school children now tour occasionally, learning about animal welfare and, in a smaller way, about what happens when communities stay silent too long out of fear of one person's carefully constructed authority and reputation. I still keep Marcus's original trail camera in a drawer in my office, and used now, a quiet reminder of how close everything came to staying hidden forever. Sometimes I take it out, turn it over in my hands, and think about how a single grainy clip changed the course of so many lives. Ellen visited again last spring, staying a full weekend this time, walking the shelter annex slowly, quietly, pausing longest near the enclosure where Biscuit strutted proudly in the sun. I wonder sometimes, she told me, what would have happened if I'd fought instead of selling. I told her she fought eventually, and it mattered. Walt still stops by most weeks. Older now, slower, but sharp as ever, often reminding me that my father would be proud not just of protecting the land, but of what I'd built from the wreckage Diane left behind. I believe him, though I still wish my father were here to see it himself. Pete brought his young daughter by the shelter annex last month, letting her feed the rescued rabbits while he told her, in simplified terms, about the case that made him want to keep working in animal welfare permanently. She named one rabbit detective, insisting it had helped solve the whole mystery. I laughed harder at that than I had in weeks, watching a 6-year-old assign heroic credit to a rescued rabbit, thinking privately that in some strange way, every animal recovered that day had indeed helped solve something far larger than themselves, a pattern of cruelty hidden behind ordinary suburban respectability. The county's transparency reforms, now fully implemented, have already prevented at least 2 similar situations in neighboring HOAs. According to Priya, who occasionally consults on cases citing our situation as precedent. You didn't just protect your own land, she told me recently.
You changed how this worked.
I think about that sentence often now, standing at the southern fence line where camouflaged branches once hid a gate built entirely on lies. The land looks ordinary these days, unremarkable even. Cattle grazing quietly, rescued animals recovering steadily, sunlight falling evenly across ground that once held so much darkness beneath it. Diane remains in prison, her appeal exhausted, her family's reputation permanently tied now to the very cruelty she spent years pretending my neglect represented. I don't think about her often anymore, though when I do, I mostly think about how thoroughly her own carefully built system eventually exposed and convicted her. Carla's leading Millbrook Ridge Estates into its 2nd year of open, transparent governance now, hosting community potlucks near the new garden instead of tents, fear-driven meetings behind closed doors. I attended the last one, standing beside Ellen, watching neighbors who once feared each other finally, slowly, learn how to trust again. My father's ranch feels fully mine now in a way it hadn't since his funeral. Not because grief has disappeared entirely, but because I finally understand what he protected all those years, not just land, but the principle that quiet, patient refusal can eventually outlast even the most determined intimidation campaign. The shelter annex marked its 2nd anniversary last week, over 400 animals having passed through its gates since that first chaotic rescue day, most placed in loving homes, a handful, like Biscuit, staying permanently as living reminders of exactly what patient, careful documentation eventually managed to expose and correct. I stood at that fence line again this evening, watching the sun set behind the tree line where a hidden gate once stood, now replaced by open pasture stretching uninterrupted toward the horizon. My father always said the land remembers everything. I finally understand what he meant, standing here, watching it heal completely. 200 animals once suffered quietly behind that fence line, hidden by lies, fear, and a community too intimidated to ask the right questions out loud. Today, that same ground grows vegetables, shelters rescued creatures, and stands as proof that even the most carefully hidden cruelty eventually meets daylight. My father's ranch, once threatened with condemnation over a lie about being unused, now thrives more fully than it ever did during those uncertain months after his funeral. Standing as quiet, undeniable proof that some fights, however exhausting, are always worth finishing all the way through to the very end. My father used to say a ranch teaches you who you really are once nobody's watching. Standing here now, land healed, animals safe, truth fully told, I know exactly who I turned out to be, his daughter, stubborn enough to keep looking, even after everyone told her to sign and walk away. The END.